Thank you, Don. I just do need to correct you on the pronunciation of the company that I'm currently MD for and will be chair. It's Mare Terram. Mare for sea, terra for land, but you're not alone in mispronouncing it. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I've been asked to speak about three interdependent issues, those being business adaptability, industry sustainability, and community accountability. With reference to the livestock export industry, although I'm the first to admit that I'm no expert in the livestock export industry, and so therefore I'll draw on some learnings from other industries with which I have been involved, with Mare Terram in the seafood industry, the wild fishing industry, and with Craig Mostyn Group in the pork industry. And some of the learnings from those supply chains and industry sectors hopefully will be of benefit here. I don't want my speech to be contentious, but I did pick up on a couple of things that were said earlier today. David Garvin said that it has been a shit year. Well, it has been a shit year for some sectors of the live export supply chain, but it certainly hasn't been for everybody. And so what I'd like to do is during this presentation talk a bit about a supply chain and how all parts of the supply chain need to be working for the industry to be sustainable. David also said that it wasn't fair that Animals Australia and RSPCA hadn't given credit to the live export industry for the work that it had done. And I would challenge you as to whether that's a reasonable expectation. Is it ever going to be reasonable to expect that bodies like that will give you credit for that? Or in fact, do you need to be leading the charge? There's certainly absolute truth in the fact that you want a level playing field. You want the rest of the world that you're competing with to be on the same playing field as you. But I think to be seeking praise from those types of bodies is not where you should be. You want to be conversing with them and setting the agenda so that you're leading the charge, you're ahead of the curve. There's been, this is a headline from 2 weeks ago. The Minister McTiernan referenced it. But what this does, it draws together all three of those components that I mentioned: business adaptability. You've got the adaptability of both the growers and the shippers that need to deal with press like this. You've got the industry sustainability. This comes right to the point of sustainability of the livestock export industry, and community accountability. What's driving this? It is ultimately the community. The community is saying that the behaviour of certain components of the industry sector are not up to their expectations. There's also been a lot of other recent press showing how the industry that you're operating in is changing. So you've got consolidation in the growing sector, and in fact that is supply chain consolidation, as a particular owner can own more and more of the supply chain from grower to customer. You've got new processing facilities opening up in northern Western Australia. You've got the processing sector, one of the larger West Australian processing companies, reporting a loss. So you've got all this quite disparate supply chain where growers of livestock might be highly profitable in these times where prices are high, but some parts of the supply chain are not profitable and therefore not working. And some of the issues facing the live export industry are consolidation across the industry, whether that's vertically up and down the chain, or whether that's across the supply chain, owning more and more farms or more and more processing facilities. Vertical integration compresses the supply chain and it can distort profit within the supply chain. And particularly if you end up with an export customer that owns back into the supply chain, then where that profit is taken can vary. If you have an export customer that owns from grower through shipper or processor to customer, they can choose whether they take the profit in the export country or in Australia, and that will have significant implications for the supply chain in Australia. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the high prices in Australia for livestock are moving more of the profit in the whole supply chain back towards growers at this point in time. No doubt that will shift around, but as it does, you get disparity in the chain, you get lack of investment. You've also got an environment where you're getting increased welfare pressure. There is no question that will continue, whether it's the meat trade, whether it's seafood, whatever food industry we're in that deals with animals and live things, there will be increasing pressure on welfare. And you've got, without trying to again be contentious, you've got the poor performance of a listed company in this space, and that has an impact on investment and perception of the industry. So how do businesses adapt? Australian agribusiness tends to be disjointed. Oh. Sorry, just let me go back. With different ownership of different segments of the supply chain. So you have the owners of the farms, breeder or grower farms, or feedlots, through to the processor or the consolidator or the exporter, and then you have customers, domestic or export. But they're all owned by different parts of the supply chain. And so each part of the supply chain tries to make its own profit without consideration of the whole chain or the rest of the industry. And the long-term industry survival requires that all components of the supply chain are profitable, because without the whole supply chain being profitable, there won't be the investment in some parts of it. So if the processing sector is always unprofitable, it will disappear. People will exit until it becomes profitable. What does that do? Then there's less demand for livestock, and that drives prices down. And so one of the things that agriculture generally needs to do is to look at whole supply chains. If you're wealthy enough, you can buy the supply chain, and some industries do that, and I'll talk about the pork and the seafood industry, where that's much easier to do and more common. In the beef and sheep industries, it's much harder to do unless you're extremely wealthy. But linking all of those components of the supply chain is key to the industry success. So supplying customers with products they want is ultimately what you need to do, whether those are customers in Australia or customers elsewhere, whether they are end consumers or whether they're the next piece of the supply chain. But the agribusiness requirement is to supply customers with what they want. And as I mentioned, all parts of the supply chain need to have an acceptable return, because without an acceptable return, there will be insufficient investment. Whether that's insufficient investment on farm, whether that's insufficient investment in processing or in ships or in other components. If there isn't the investment, then the assets will deteriorate and will become uncompetitive. And once they become uncompetitive, then the industry itself is threatened. So how do you get a whole of supply chain approach? It's interesting in the pork industry, and I've heard it said in the beef industry as well, that loyalty is worth 5 cents a kilo. So simply getting supply chain cooperation on price is extremely difficult. You can own it, as I've mentioned. There are supply chains which are fully owned. that gives you vertical integration. You own all the parts of the supply chain, and that gives cooperation across all of it. However, that is very expensive, so depending upon the supply chain, but certainly in the live export industry, very expensive. Contracts and agreements are probably the most sensible and workable way of getting cooperation across the supply chain. Regulation. Regulators are reluctant to impose regulations on supply chains. We see it in some industries, the potato industry in Western Australia, although I think that's just about gone. So it's not a likely way of driving value. And then there's cooperation. Well, cooperation requires trust, and that will sometimes work with long-term relationships, but it won't always work. Really, long-term contracts are the most certain way of getting cooperation across supply chains. And what that allows people to do is to identify what the customer requirements are, and then to work back through the supply chain to meet them. And really that then can deliver adequate return on investment across the whole supply chain. I'll talk a little bit about the pork industry, and a couple of things that strike me about the industry in general before I go into detail are that the pork industry has a single voice. It has a levy-funded body called Australian Pork Limited, which has the ear of government. And it also has a very proactive stance. And hopefully RSPCA and other animal welfare bodies will support. But my understanding is that they really seek to be ahead of the curve in all of the animal welfare agendas that they have, so that rather than being reactionary, they're setting the agenda. Rather than being surprised by an outcome, they're setting the agenda. So firstly, by having a single voice at federal and state government, they will be heard rather than disparate voices. A much harder thing to do is to get your message across when there are more than one group with potentially different agendas. But right now, the pork industry is going through some turmoil. It is going through a very low Farmgate price. It's going through that because of excess supply. And the adage in the pork industry is that the last pig produced will set the price for all of the pigs. So all 5 million pigs produced in Australia at the moment, the last pig or the last 1,000 pigs are setting the price, and that price is significantly lower than it has been, and it fell very quickly. There's a lot of business adaptability issues that need to be dealt with in that. There are businesses that will have a price below their cost of production, and obviously they will go out of business. It has import competition. There has been some recent press about supermarkets bringing in fully cooked pork ribs, marinated in a bag into the microwave and cooked up for about $12 to $15 a kilo, which is lower than the price that a raw set of ribs would be sold in Australia. So we've got industry sustainability issues as people find their ways around the biosecurity measures that have here to date protected the fresh pork industry. They have significant competition in the export market. Most of the Australian pork is exported to Singapore as a fresh product. Well, the rest of the world is trying to put pork into Singapore, and the Singapore government's trying to persuade their consumers and their population that really frozen pork's as good as fresh pork. So they've got very significant, again, industry sustainability issues in their export markets. And they have welfare. As with any animal industry, they have significant welfare issues. But as I mentioned earlier, they have taken some proactive steps. 5 years ago, the pork industry decided on a voluntary code of practice to move to eliminating sow stalls. Now, it was voluntary, but very soon after it was announced, one of the major supermarkets jumped on board and said they would only buy sow stall-free pork. So that gave it a whole lot of impetus and allowed the industry to get some certain return and invest, particularly those that were advanced enough, the growers who were advanced enough to make the investment. And health, eating pork, is it a lean meat, is it not a lean meat? Certainly the industry would argue it's the other white meat and it's extremely lean, but that remains an issue of community accountability that the industry needs to deal with. So what caused the huge price collapse in the pork industry? Well, it was a production focus. It was a focus by all of the producers looking at the price of pork and saying, wow, if I could just produce another 1,000 pigs a week, I could get the high prices. So everybody around Australia did that, and we saw a significant increase in production because there wasn't a consumer focus. It was all around production and trying to drive profit through volume. The farmers acted independently from the supply chain, and in fact were providing inaccurate information to the industry body so that the industry body couldn't put out a warning, and so it took everybody by surprise when the price fell off a cliff. A production focus versus a consumer focus. Production, it should be a market pull rather than a production push. I'm sure you've all heard of this in sort of basic economics and agri-theory, but it really is so real when you see an example like the pork industry that happened in the beginning of this year and is really struggling. Engages the entire supply chain, again, if that's possible, and distributes the profits across the supply chain. So at the moment, nobody's making any money. But had this been managed a bit better, it would have been possible that some would have. How could it be achieved? Well, it can be achieved by long-term contracts. So with customers entering into contracts for production that take out the highs of price, but also take out the lows. It's a much more predictable model, and it is starting to happen. It can also occur through ownership and significant capital investment. So an example of a pork industry that has got supply chain control is in Western Australia, where supermarkets enter into contracts with growers, and then they enter into separate contracts with processors. So the growers know that they have a market for their product, assuming it's grown to a certain specification. The processor knows that it's got a certain volume. It can invest in machinery and chillers and all of the big capital items that are required. And so the West Australian industry, in this significant downturn in profitability, has been much less severely hit than the rest of Australia. So there's certainly items that you can take on board in any supply chain to seek to improve it. A successful pork business can be vertically integrated because it is possible to own the breeder farms and the grower farms, to own the processing, to own the value adding, or to outsource and contract the value adding, to have the retail contracts, have grower contracts for those pigs you don't own, and export and buy products contracts. So all of that supply chain can be locked up by a player that's prepared to commit for the long term. And it's much more about commitment in entering into these long-term contracts. 5- and 10-year contracts are required to make it work. Perhaps if we turn our mind to the wild-caught prawn industry. There are some issues facing it at the moment. Rising costs. It's a very diesel and labour-driven business, so diesel prices over the last 2 years have risen very significantly. We've had a disease called white spot disease that was originally in farmed prawns in Queensland, escaped into Moreton Bay in Queensland. A serious industry sustainability outcome there. And it was very interesting to see how that played out. The importers of prawns approached the federal government and said, well, it's now in the wild, there's nothing left to protect, you should reduce all of the biosecurity measures you have on imported prawns because there's just no point anymore. Fortunately, Department of Agriculture and Water Resources took a different perspective, and that was that they would actually tighten up biosecurity, and there's been significant investment in trying to contain the outbreak in Queensland waters, and hopefully a strong wild population will overcome the virus. But those sorts of things, there's not one answer to a disaster like that. There's competition from imported prawns, competition from between farmed prawns and wild prawns in Australia, and competition in the export market. Australia's, as it usually is in agriculture, it's quite an expensive producer. And we have welfare issues. You wouldn't think that there were significant welfare issues in the prawn industry, but in the farmed prawn industry, an issue that recently came to light, and I wasn't even aware of it until I read it in the ABC in September, is a thing called ablation, and it's reasonably horrific. It's the cutting off of one eyeball from breeder prawns in prawn farms. Exactly how they do it with so many prawns, I'm not sure. But the press went berserk. Animals Australia, not surprisingly, went berserk. Most people who read the article thought this was horrific. And the industry response was, if we don't do it, we won't be profitable. Who cares? What member of the community cares whether they're profitable or not if they're doing something that appears to be so horrific? And I think that is a lesson for all of us. The response that we give needs to be well aware of the community expectations, and profit is not one of them. So a successful fishing business needs to own its own quota. So most fisheries, or I think all commercial fisheries in Australia, are quoted either by state government or federal legislation. In order to control a supply chain, you need to own quota, because that's what gives you the right to catch the product. Generally, factory vessels, most vessels are out for more than a week. Our prawn vessels at Maritarum are out for 3 weeks, so the vessel needs to be able to process and freeze and store on board. They need to be able to do their own value adding. So in prawns, whether that's peeling, in scallops, whether that's shucking, crabs, most people would prefer to have their crab linguine with the meat in it rather than a whole crab. It gets rather cumbersome to eat. So value adding and peeling those products are part of the supply chain. And direct marketing. So our business, as many others, have the relationships in the export markets, direct relationships into supermarkets and into the food service sector. The fishing industry is easier to do it. It's less capital, and in fact, even fishermen with single vessels are able to consolidate their supply chain because it is a fairly simple supply chain. Diversification. Diversification in fishing is a key outcome. I think diversification in agriculture, where it can be achieved, is a very productive outcome. Our business recently diversified into mackerel. That gives us a different species, different price points, different demand and supply drivers, different vessel and different fishing location. So our business is public, capital is easier to obtain. But diversification in agribusiness, and particularly in fishing, is a very valuable way to proceed. I've talked about the supply chain and how you consolidate it, but I don't pretend that operating in different supply chain sectors is not challenging. There are quite different skills required to be a farmer, a processor, a marketer, or an exporter. Very different skills. So organisations need to be broad enough and large enough to accommodate that. They need capital. There's no question that capital is required. We've talked a bit about community accountability, and I won't dwell on it, but it is the licence given to the agriculture sector by the community to operate. In fishing, it's the rights. It's the rights to go into public water and take what is effectively a public resource. And in agriculture, it's similar. And the expectations are increasing. We would all be foolish to sit here and think that we've reached a level where it's not going to get harder. It is. Tomorrow will be harder in that respect than today. Profit, as I mentioned in the prawn example, is an unacceptable excuse for not meeting community expectations. And the industry, whatever industry it is, needs to be proactive and to raise the bar, continuously raise the bar so that you're beyond reproach. And as part of that, it's about exiting non-conformers. So how do you do that? That will vary by industry, but the 90% of good operators in an industry don't want to be dragged down by the 10% that are non-compliant, because that's what will happen. Competitive advantage, each organisation, each business, each industry needs to determine its competitive advantage, and I see the competitive advantage is defined in two ways. It's what your customers think you are better at than your competitors, whether that's price, whether it's customer service, whether it's quality of product, or whether it's reliable supply. There will be a whole lot of definitions that relate to an industry. But defining that competitive advantage from your customer's perspective is key. And then also, what can you do that is better than your competitors? So that might be cost, that your customer doesn't see directly, but can you be more cost effective? Because at the end of the day, it is only the most cost effective producers that will survive. So to summarise, it is all about the supply chain. It is all about linking the components of the supply chain so that everybody in that chain gets a fair return on their investment, trying to take out the highs in price and the lows in price so that the industry can sustainably grow. So I hope that's been useful to you, and I hope the industry examples that are non-meat export help. Thank you.